Have you ever noticed how incredibly, almost painfully difficult it is to just walk away from something that is actively hurting you? I'm talking about a toxic relationship, a business project that's clearly doomed, or an investment that's just plummeting. We tell ourselves we're just being resilient, right? We say things like, quitting is for losers. But what if that persistence isn't resilience at all? What if it's actually a predictable, mathematically precise psychological glitch? Welcome to today's Explainer. Today we're diving deep into the architecture of our own irrationality. We are going to look at exactly why we categorically refuse to cut our losses, and more importantly, how we can finally achieve the cold, rational detachment required to let things go. Picture this scenario for a second. You've bought a really expensive ticket to a game or a concert you've been dying to see. But on the actual day of the event, a massive, highly dangerous blizzard hits. The roads are completely treacherous. Now, if you hadn't already bought that ticket, you wouldn't even dream of leaving your house. No way. And yet, because you've already paid for it, you find yourself gripping the steering wheel, driving through blinding snow, literally risking your life in your car. So why do we do this? Why do we stubbornly pour our time, our hard-earned money, and our precious emotional energy into dangerous or completely failing situations just to avoid feeling like we wasted our initial investment? Well, the answer to that question is the entire foundation of what we're talking about today. To really understand this stubbornness, we have to properly diagnose the underlying condition. So let's get into Section 1, the disease, loss aversion. The Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman spent years meticulously analyzing this phenomenon, and what he found reveals a frankly brutal asymmetry in human emotion. When it comes to gains and losses, we are just not balanced creatures, at all. The psychological pain of losing is actually somewhere between 1.5 to 2.5 times more intense than the joy of gaining the exact same amount. Just let that sink in for a moment. If you find a $100 bill on the sidewalk, you get a nice, fleeting thrill. But if you lose $100, that stings. It practically ruins your whole day, doesn't it? We are fundamentally wired to weigh our losses with roughly twice the emotional gravity of our gains. Now, the absolutely crucial thing to understand here is that this extreme sensitivity to loss, it isn't some modern character flaw. You really shouldn't feel guilty about it. It is an ancient, deeply ingrained evolutionary survival mechanism. Think about the brutal environments where human beings actually evolved. The organisms that treated immediate threats as vastly more urgent than potential opportunities, those were the ones that survived and reproduced. Look, if you missed out on an opportunity to grab an extra piece of fruit, okay, you might be a little hungry. But if you ignored a threat like a predator in the bushes, you were dead. Negativity and that desperate urge to escape simply had to dominate positivity and the desire to approach. We are the direct descendants of those highly anxious, extraordinarily loss-averse survivors. So how exactly does this ancient instinct sabotage our real-world modern decisions? Consider this little gamble. Let's say you're offered a bet on this simple toss of a coin. If it lands on tails, you lose $100. But if it lands on heads, you win $150. Do you take it? Mathematically speaking, this is an incredibly favorable bet. The expected value is hugely positive. If you played this exact game 1,000 times, you'd end up wealthy. But when presented with this, most people instinctively reject it out of hand. Why? Because the sheer terror of parting with that $100 completely overpowers the perfectly rational hope of gaining $150. Your logical brain knows it's a great deal, but your emotional brain is literally screaming at you to protect what you already have. This invisible, primitive weight drags down our logic every single day. Which brings us to Section 2, the complications. Let's explore how these ancient instincts mutate into absolute psychological traps in our modern lives. When you drop our ancestral fear of loss into, say, the modern stock market or complex corporate projects, it creates highly predictable traps. The first big one is called the disposition effect. It's a massive issue in finance, but honestly, it applies to almost everything we do. Here's how it plays out. Imagine you have two different investments. One is doing brilliantly, making you a solid profit. The other is failing miserably. What do most people naturally do? They sell the winner early. Why? Because cashing it in gives them a quick, satisfying hit of pleasure. It locks in a definitive success on their internal mental scorecard. But they will fiercely, stubbornly hold on to that losing investment. They will let it bleed them dry. Because the exact second you sell that losing stock, you have to formally close the mental account on a failure. You have to look in the mirror and admit defeat. And as we've just learned, the emotional agony of that loss is so intense that we will literally risk total financial ruin just to postpone feeling it. And that beautifully, or perhaps I should say tragically, sets up our next major trap, the sunk cost fallacy. Imagine a large company has already spent $50 million on a massive new project, but the project is a total disaster. It's way behind schedule, the technology they're using is already obsolete, and it is painfully clear it's never going to turn a profit. However, it requires another $60 million just to drag it across the finish line. Now, the logical alternative is to take that $60 million and invest it in a brand new, highly profitable venture instead. So, what does the company usually do? All too often, an executive team afflicted by sunk costs drive right into the blizzard. They throw $60 million of good money directly after $50 million of bad money. Why on earth do they do this? Because walking away means those executives have to accept the absolute crushing humiliation of closing the account on a catastrophic failure. They simply cannot let go of the resources they've already sunk, so they sink even more. This whole dynamic illustrates just how easily our complex minds can be entirely hacked by the mere illusion of loss. Consider a really famous experiment from Kahneman's research. Imagine you are handed 50 pounds. You are then given a choice, but it's framed in two entirely different ways. On one side, you're told you can keep 20 pounds. On the other side, the exact same outcome is described as lose 30 pounds. Now, objectively, mathematically, these are completely identical outcomes. You are walking away with 20 pounds either way. A strictly rational thinker wouldn't care which one they picked. The human mind, however, is not bound to reality. People heavily, consistently favor the option when the word keep is used, and they violently reject the exact same mathematical option when the word lose is used. Our brains simply glitch out based entirely on the subjective framing of the situation. What this all essentially boils down to is a rather harsh, unapologetic reality about human nature. The ultimate currency that actually rewards or punishes us, it isn't dollars or euros or quarterly business metrics. It is emotional currency. We are constantly keeping these internal mental scorecards of our self-regard and our achievements. We stubbornly refuse to walk away from bad situations. We fight totally doomed wars. We stay in incredibly toxic jobs. Because doing the sensible thing, actually cutting our losses, forces us to inflict immediate emotional pain on ourselves. It forces a direct hit to our ego. It is a profound form of mental self-dealing, where avoiding short-term psychological pain absolutely guarantees long-term destruction. All right, so how do we fix it? Section 3, the cure. Achieving rational detachment. Look, if we are biologically hardwired to make these disastrous decisions, are we just doomed? Absolutely not. Kahneman outlines a highly tactical defense mechanism to completely bypass these emotional glitches. The cure entirely lies in changing how we frame the events in our lives. We have to make a conscious shift from narrow framing to broad framing. Narrow framing is basically our default human state. It's when you treat every single decision, every little gamble, every individual loss as an isolated life-or-death disaster. If a project fails today, narrow framing makes it feel like the absolute end of the world. Broad framing, on the other hand, is the ultimate antidote. It is the conscious, deliberate practice of zooming out. It requires you to train yourself to treat every single loss not as a singular, crushing tragedy, but as just one tiny, insignificant data point in a massive, lifelong portfolio of decisions. So, here is the highly actionable advice derived directly from all this research. First, you really must learn to think like a seasoned financial trader. Experienced traders actively shield themselves from the agonizing sting of daily losses by assuming a very broad frame. They treat each and every decision as just one small part of a massive bundle. Secondly, and honestly perhaps most importantly, you have to drastically reduce the frequency with which you evaluate your outcomes. If you are checking your stock portfolio or obsessively watching the daily metrics of your new business every single day, you are guaranteed to experience the pain of small daily losses far more intensely than the joy of small daily gains. It will literally paralyze you. Deliberately avoiding that short-term feedback actually improves the quality of both your long-term decisions and your daily emotional life. Honestly, checking in once a quarter is more than enough. Kahneman even offers a specific everyday mantra for this exact mindset. I know it sounds almost entirely cliche, but mathematically and psychologically, it is incredibly profound. You win a few, you lose a few. Whenever you are faced with a risk that you know has a positive expected value, but your stomach is just churning with the primitive fear of loss, you are supposed to actively rehearse this mantra. Remind yourself, you are not on your deathbed. This is absolutely not the last gamble you will ever take in your life. You will have thousands of opportunities. By aggregating them all together, by simply telling yourself you win a few, you lose a few, you effectively neutralize the emotional poison of that immediate loss. That is how you achieve true rational detachment. Let me share a genuinely brilliant anecdote from the source material that perfectly, practically encapsulates this entire philosophy. The behavioral economist Richard Thaler was once speaking to the 25 division managers of a very large corporation. He offered them all a hypothetical gamble, a 50-50 chance to either lose a huge amount of their division's capital or double it. Now, because every single manager was narrowly framing their own specific career, and they were deeply terrified of having a massive loss on their personal record, every single one of them refused the gamble. Then Thaler turned to the CEO of the entire company. The CEO didn't even hesitate. He looked at Thaler and said, "I would like all of them to accept their risks." Why? Because the CEO was using broad framing. He knew that out of those 25 separate bets, sure, some would inevitably lose, but the majority would win, and the aggregate result would be massively, undeniably profitable for the company as a whole. The CEO wasn't crippled by the fear of one isolated loss. Which brings us directly back to you. As we wrap up this explainer, I want you to just sit with this slow, rather uncomfortable question. Really look at your life, your finances, your career. What failing commitment are you desperately holding on to right now? Are you currently driving into a blizzard just because you already paid for the ticket? Are you desperately protecting a fragile emotional scorecard instead of building your actual future? Take a deep breath. Apply that broad frame. Zoom all the way out to the grand scale of your entire life. And honestly ask yourself, what would actually happen if you finally found the courage to just let it go? I'll leave you to think about that. Until next time, stay curious and keep seeking clarity.